Thanks to all of you for joining us for the last lecture of this year anyway. I really have to say, I think in this case, in some ways, we've saved the best for last. It's really a pleasure to have Antony back up here in Fairbanks. Antony is our lead energy economist with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and I've had the real pleasure to get to know Antony over the last year or maybe a little more working with him. 2 years already, all right. Well, and it's interesting because I really remember, I learned about Antony by reputation long before I ever met him. Our Vice Chancellor for Research, Mark Myers, who many of you know as well, he said, you know, there's this guy, Antony Scott, and he's brilliant. He's one of the smartest people I know in the state. He's just unbelievable. And he would talk him up, but I'd never met this person, you know, Anthony Scott, or what is his name? Tony, you know. So, but eventually, when I got to know Antony and spend some time with him and work with him over the last couple of years, I really have to say that this is an individual who I know wakes up every day and goes to sleep at night every day thinking about what he can do to better the lives of Alaskans all over this state. And in the career path he's chosen, whether that's being the lead economist for the Regulatory Commission or whether that's leading the what division is it again, Antony? I keep the commercial division for the Division of Oil and Gas, where he really managed the state's portfolio in terms of our fossil energy resources. He thinks about what he can do to better lives for us, and he's really now working more with ACEP. It's going back to where we worked before, a little bit more on the power side, a little bit more community-based, and so he's just been a fabulous asset to us. I know I'm always interested in hearing what he has to say, and I'm really looking forward to this lecture. So thank you, Antony.
Thank you for that staggeringly nice introduction. It's not deserved. I should let you know I worked on Gasline for the state for over 10 years. The last of my time at the Regulatory Commission, I started working on the project. I worked for the Knowles administrations, Murkowski administration, Palin administration, and Parnell administration on the project. I need to clarify that the views presented here don't reflect any of them. They're my own. And they also don't reflect the universities. This is really my observations as best I can offer them. And so if you want to throw stuff, be sure to throw it at me and not of the institutions that I've worked for or are working for now. Because I spent so many years working this project and working so hard, I tend to assume a lot of background familiarity, and so it is inevitable that I will use terms and assume background knowledge that isn't shared, and for that I apologize, and hopefully we can clear some of that up at the end. So brief outline of the talk, and it actually, these things do end up getting linked at the end of the day. I want to briefly provide some basic background introduction on what the project is. We'll discuss why maybe it hasn't happened to date. I want to touch on if it's Alaska's gas, well, why can't we just make them produce or get off our land? Get off my lawn! And then talk about the state's need for a project, talk about whether the project will generate benefits for Alaskans in terms of lower energy costs, and then also talk a little bit, very briefly, about risks and rewards of the current configuration of the project involving state participation. You may well know, or not, that the state is currently contemplating to not only be an equity owner in the hardware, but also to take its hydrocarbons in kind. So its royalty gas it'll take in kind, and its tax, its production tax, it will also take in kind in the form of gas and then market those hydrocarbons. So that is the concept behind the current project configuration. And so we'll talk a little bit, just a little bit, about potential rewards and risks of that approach. So physical description. The current incarnation for this project is an LNG project. Starts on the North Slope, would take on the order of 3 BCF of gas, more or less. Gas enters a gas treatment plant where impurities are removed. The gas treatment plant is at least a $10 billion project all by itself. The plant will remove impurities. It'll chill the gas, making it pipeline ready. Compression will be added so that when the gas enters the pipeline, it's at pressure and it's moving. Along the way, the pipeline itself will notionally be a 42-inch high-pressure pipeline carrying a rich gas stream. Rich gas stream means there are gas liquids which stay entrained in the gas because it's at high pressure. Transport roughly 800 miles to an LNG plant in Nikiski in Cook Inlet, where the gas will then be chilled to liquefy it so it can be economically transported on tankers. The liquefaction plant will come in probably well north of $23 billion is my guess. This is extremely sophisticated and capital-intensive plant. The gas will be chilled. There'll be some storage facilities on site, some docks, loading, utilities, that sort of thing. The project would be history's largest private undertaking, at least in today's dollars. It is, from an economic perspective, truly staggeringly massive with all of the risks and potential rewards that that may entail. Consider that in 2010, the world's largest private undertaking at that point was an $18 billion project, also an LNG project in Papua New Guinea. Today, to date, the largest private project, also an LNG project, this time in Australia, expected to cost $34 billion. This project is considerably larger than either of those. It will be interesting to see the capacity for international capital markets to support the project. So it's big. The project proceeds in stages right now. The project is about to enter or has entered the pre-FEED stage. FEED stands for front-end engineering and design. This is a period in which the project is going to become better defined. How much gas, from where, what do we think that entails for the design of the pipeline at a relatively high level, and so on. Some of the more of the contours of the project will start getting nailed down in the next 18 months or so. Critical period, because during this period, the lessees, the North Slope producers, and the state, as well as TransCanada, will be entering into a long series of contracts and agreements, which will define the nature of the company's relationship to each other on the project and to the state. There are great many details of tremendous commercial importance, and those will get nailed down, hopefully. We'll reach agreement in the next 18 months or so, and those contracts would then go to the legislature for an up or down vote of approval. Assuming everybody can come to terms and the legislature blessed the deal such as it was and thought it made sense, project would proceed to full-on FEED, roughly speaking a $2 billion effort over 2 to 3 years. I'm guessing more like 3. And at the conclusion of that period is when it's the time that actually those of us who've been working trying to make this thing happen, both on the company side and on the state side in various ways. At the conclusion of that, people will be able to make a decision. Does this thing make sense or not? The project will be well enough defined and well enough understood, and the risks narrowed somewhat because it'll be better understood, that a final investment decision about whether to go or no go can be made. And at that point, I mean, that'll be a good point for the state to get, because at that point, if it doesn't make sense to do and people walk away, well, things are clear then. I mean, and clarity is a good thing. If instead, it makes sense to do this thing and let's go, that'll be an awfully exciting time. Some people have been waiting many decades. And at that point then, about 95% of the overall cost, the 45 to 55 or 65 billion dollars, will get spent over the subsequent 4 to 5 years. So why hasn't a project happened so far? Why hasn't it happened? Well, pretty obviously, benefits of a project have to exceed costs of not proceeding for all of the commercial parties. So what are benefits for a commercial party? It's more complicated than you might think, actually. So I'll give you just a subset. Well, one is profits, right? It might be a profitable project, and if it were a profitable project, that'd be a good thing. The other thing, though, which is not always appreciated is, and this is a benefit, is the scale of the project itself confers benefits. The North Slope lessees are in the business of producing and selling hydrocarbons. And every day that they produce and sell hydrocarbons, they're moving what they've got along on the treadmill is falling off the end. They've got to replace it. And reserves replacement in this business is tough. And it's especially tough if you're a huge company producing a huge amount of hydrocarbons. So your appetite for finding and developing new hydrocarbons is vast. And so the fact that this is a very large project actually does hold some attraction, because in one fell swoop you can replace a great deal of reserves. Now it's a two-edged sword, because big carries its own risks as well, but we're talking benefits, and scale is a benefit. The project will also prolong North Slope field life in terms of the ability to produce oil, because if you're producing gas, now you can take the fixed costs of the vast North Slope infrastructure and spread it out over more hydrocarbons. And that'll allow you economically to produce more oil for longer than you otherwise would. And that's a benefit for real. Another benefit, which is often not really appreciated, is that if a gas line happens, then it will delay, potentially by decades, the date when dismantlement, removal, and restoration of the North Slope infrastructure needs to occur. The state's leases require the lessees to clean up their mess when they're done. You know, you can't just go home. You have to clean up your mess, and the mess needs to be cleaned up to the satisfaction of the Commissioner of Natural Resources, whoever he or she is at the time. It's a little more complicated than that, but not a whole lot. I mean, we don't have clear standards for what that entails, for what DR&R actually entails. It's certainly a multi-billion-dollar liability, and it's a set of expenditures which, when they have to be undertaken, don't produce any benefit. It's just you've got to spend it. So delaying that is certainly a good thing, especially if you can make some money in the process. Think about it, if you had a Gasline project which only broke even, and the only thing that it did was delayed by decades the expenditure of billions of dollars that got you nothing, you would do it. That would be a good deal. So this is real. Profitability. This is where things get complicated. So this is super stylized, right? This is not actual. So you have a stylized cash flow where you have expenditures up front. You have to spend money to build a project, vast sums of money. Once it's built, you get to enjoy cash flow. That's a nice thing, right? The money comes in. Hopefully it's profitable on a going forward basis. But how do you evaluate this stream of cash flow? Well, there are different ways to do it. You can look at the net present value, or you can look at the internal rate of return. You can look at profitability ratios. There are different ways of evaluating this stream of cash flow. All of the companies use all of these measures. They weight them all differently. The companies make decisions differently. I don't know how they make decisions. But they do make decisions in part on the basis of different measures of profitability and different relative weights of the measures of profitability. So we'll come back to this. But you can look at the same and see a different part of it, even among the three different companies. Even if they all saw exactly the same picture, they might interpret it differently. Okay. Of course, those benefits, such as they are subject to considerable risk. There's price risk and construction cost risk. There's geologic risk. We don't really know how much gas there is in Point Thompson. We don't really know how it's going to be produced. And near and dear to the company's heart, foremost in their minds often is fiscal risk. And fiscal risk is the risk that, having chosen to pursue this project and invested tens of billions of dollars, the state decides that they want a better deal. And they raise taxes and take away a bunch of the value of the project. And this is, as long as I've been around the project, since 2003, this is 2002, this has been a major subject of conversation, is how to handle the fiscal risk. Okay, so those are all risks to benefits. There are costs, of course, as well as benefits. The costs, obviously, the construction costs. Oil loss at Prudhoe Bay, for many, many years, this was a big deal. It wasn't time yet, actually, to produce the gas, because if you produce the gas at Prudhoe Bay, you'd lose a lot of reservoir energy, and in so doing, you'd lose the opportunity to produce a lot of oil there. Because oil was so much more valuable than natural gas, it made sense to produce the gas, re-inject it, maintain reservoir energy, and enhance oil recovery. And so that has been the prime reason why gas hasn't been produced for a very, very, very long time. We may, just looking at commercial decisions on the part of the actors right now, we may be at a period where that's changing, where indeed it's time, given the amount of oil that's been produced out of the reservoir, to think about blowing the reservoir down. There will probably be some oil loss if you do that, but it's likely to be relatively modest. Again, just judging from the behavior of the commercial actors now, who appear to be more interested in this project than they were before. This is a big one, option value. Project like this you get to do once. You don't redo it. There are no do-overs. Once you do it, you don't get to do it again. And there are two big parts of that. One of the big parts of giving up the option value by deciding to proceed today is that you're not any longer in a position to cut a better deal with the state. There's a negotiation been ongoing for a long time now, over a decade, both in public and in private, about what fiscal terms will be. So in this dance, once the deal is done, you can't cut a better deal. And so waiting has got its own benefits. But it's also the case that waiting has got benefits in terms of market conditions. I mean, under the Murkowski administration, we were pushing like heck to try to get a project. And if that project had proceeded to North America along the timelines that we'd contemplated, construction would have happened during the time of highest possible costs. And gas production would be happening at a time of historically low gas prices. So it would have been a bad deal, right? The last thing in terms of cost, and this is enormous, is that the project is such a big project that doing this project affects the other projects that you can do. So if you're ConocoPhillips, if you decide to do an LNG project, there are other projects in your portfolio, in your queue, that will wait, and they will wait a number of years. This isn't merely a matter of overall cost, although that matters. It is critically a matter of capacity, the ability of the company to muster the manpower and expertise to do the project. So, yes?
If you go further, can you explain PBU and SGDA?
I'm so glad you asked that. PBU is the Prudhoe Bay unit. So it's Prudhoe Bay. The SGDA is the Stranded Gas Development Act, and that was the law on the books at the time and the framework under which the Murkowski administration tried to negotiate a deal to facilitate a project. The SGDA is no longer effective, and actually this last legislature passed, I don't know that it's got a name, SB 138, and that bill is the current vehicle by which this project is proceeding. So before we get to this, the point then is there are lots of costs, and there are lots of benefits, and there are lots of risks, and the views that different companies have on these things will differ. They're not a monolith, and they're not all aligned. They don't all see things the same way. Their capacities are different. Their strategic needs are different. And so you need all of those companies to be aligned with each other. We talk a lot about alignment with the state, and I don't mean to discount that. But it is also the case that all three companies, all three lessees, need to want to do this, and they need to want to do this at the same time. And that's not an easy thing to have kind of come together, because you can have different relative perceptions of what these benefits are and what the costs are and what the relative risks are. So my view is, other than oil loss, the heterogeneity or diversity of views and strategic goals and needs of the companies has been enormously important in terms of stalling progress. Actually, I wouldn't say, that's the wrong phrase. There's been a lot of progress, actually, an enormous amount of progress, believe it or not, in the last 10 years. I think so. I'm not really a petroleum reservoir guy, but I think the answer to that, generally speaking, is yeah, it's not really dependent. The heavy oil resource that they're talking, I mean, that's a long separate conversation in terms of what kind of resource we're talking about and where we're talking about it in production technologies. But in general, that's not the main issue at play. That's a really good question. So if the companies, so you can certainly imagine circumstance in which the companies want to do it, and they might even think that the benefits of proceeding are positive, and yet they might be positive more in the future, so let's wait a while, right? But for Alaska, we've been wanting this thing to happen now, right? We don't have other worldwide opportunities. We don't have a big worldwide portfolio. We want it now. At least every administration I ever worked for wanted it now. So then the question is, well, what can we do about it? And it is the case that in our leases, there is an implied duty on the part of lessees to develop and produce the hydrocarbons when it is reasonably prudent to do so. And so this is just language lifted from our 1951 Division of Lands 1 lease, 1959 Division of Lands 1 lease, which is the main lease form underlying most of the leases at Prudhoe Bay and many of the leases in Point Thompson. And it, you know, upon discovery of oil or gas in paying quantities, and it's been discovered in paying quantities, The lessee shall drill such wells as a reasonably prudent operator would drill, having due regard for the interests of the lessor as well as the interests of the lessee. This language says or implies that it's not only the lessee that gets to call the shots. The lessor's interests count as well. And the lessor's interests are supposed to be protected such that the lessee produces when it is reasonably profitable to do so. The state's new form lease, many of the leases in Point Thompson are new form leases. A couple of them in Prudhoe Bay, I think, are more explicit. Paragraph 13, Part B is the relevant part here, but it implies and says much the same thing. Again, a reasonable and prudent operator, if there's sufficient hydrocarbons to pay for the ordinary costs of drilling, completing, and producing an additional well, the lessee shall drill those wells as a reasonable, prudent operator would drill, having due regard, again, both for the interests of the lessor, that's us, and the lessee. So there is an obligation to go forward, and this obligation is actually kind of a big deal. You need to proceed if it's reasonably prudent to do so. That's a condition of the lease. It's part of the deal. Because we, again, can't just wait around for whenever it's optimal for the lessee. However, in the real world, there are practical difficulties with making these terms real for this project. Prudence is the critical phrase here. What would a prudent operator do? And that, again, was going to be defined in a court of law. And unfortunately, there are no objective standards. There are not lots of projects like this running around that producers have done. Okay? In fact, there are very, very few projects that are like this, of this scale. As well, you know, the lease talks about drilling wells, although there's kind of an implied duty to develop some of the infrastructure. There's no case law out there that remotely speaks to tens of billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. And for an LNG project, it's even worse because the pricing terms for LNG project, you have to have bilateral contracts which are negotiated in private. You don't have transparent pricing. This stuff is not all public. It's confidential, in fact. So trying to bring a duty to develop and market case, again, especially for an LNG project, is, I think, catastrophically difficult. And there's a reason why, just looking at it from the outside, you can see good reasons why people wouldn't be particularly interested in trying to make a project happen through this means. So it's kind of too bad because the state could help provide a coordinating role to facilitate the interests of all parties to come see things a certain way. And if I had another hour of talking time, I could talk about why and how the Alaska Gasline Inducement Act was an attempt to do just that. But again, that's a subject for another time. So let's talk about state need for a project. Well, we're going to talk about state budget needs for a project and household energy budgets needs for a project. So all of this, of course, involves predicting what the future will look like, and that's hard. In the fiscal year 2013 governor's budget, here's what the legislative fiscal analyst had to say about it. The governor's request for the budget in fiscal year 13 leaves a projected surplus of $1.8 billion. And the analyst's focus in this summary for the legislature was really geared around the rate of increase in operating budget of state agencies. And for the prior 5, 6, 7 years, I'm not sure, The rate of growth in state agency spending was north of 7% per year. And what the blue line represents is the state's capital reserves, its savings account, the size of its savings account, not including the permanent fund, if that 7.2 or 7.3% rate of growth were to continue going forward. And so the budget analysts was very concerned about pointing out that 7-point-something% rate of growth in state budget was not sustainable given projections of oil revenues and so on. And the green line represents the state's savings accounts associated with growth in state budget of 3.2%. So if state budgets were the operating budgets were to increase at 3.2% per year going forward, you can see that it's not really quite indefinite, but certainly through the end of the period, through fiscal year 2025, we'd still have quite healthy savings reserves. We'd be in pretty good shape and probably in a position to draw down our savings and weather things for a good while going forward, beyond that, before we hit zero.
Can I ask a question there?
Yeah.
What's the basis, what's the assumption of oil prices over that period?
So I forget the specific number, but it was on the order of $109 a barrel, $110 a barrel. No, it's not flat. The DOR doesn't assume a flat price. They have a price trajectory and they have a production trajectory. These income vectors, see, this is both income and expense together, but the income vector part of this was in effect generated by the Department of Revenue's revenue source book from the fall, prior to when this was put together.
The answer is, what's the rate of increase of the oil price? That's my question.
Yeah, I would have to go and look at the fall revenue source book for
Is there an
2012.
increase rate? I mean, if this is based on a flat rate.
No, it's not flat. It was not flat.
Well, I'm saying how unflat is it?
And I would direct you to that resource. I mean, seriously, I can't remember everything.
That's a very important assumption. I mean,
It's not my assumption. It's not my assumption.
It's important that this audience know that. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. 2 years later, fiscal year 15. The world's changed. Budget proposed by the governor's got a deficit over $1 billion. This is not primarily price driven. This is the shape of, or the trajectory of the state's savings through 2024, so pretty similar period, assuming zero rate of growth in state agency operating budgets and flat capital budgets of about $800 million a year. There's not a radically different price trajectory that's informing this. It's a little different, but I would wager it's within a couple of dollars. And again, if you would like to look this up, look at the fall revenue source book for 2014. So it's a very different picture. Things look grim from a state future perspective. And it just is what it is. Oil gets made slowly. And prices are what they are.
Doesn't this also reflect the lower tax regime that the legislature put through?
It may. It probably does. The question was whether this also reflects recent changes in the oil tax regime. It certainly reflects changes in the oil tax regime. Exactly how those play out in terms of affecting this, I can't say. I can say that expectations about capital expenditures and upstream costs have changed from one fall revenue source book that informed the 2013 report to 2 years later. So costs changed, prices changed, and production expectations changed, as well as a changed tax regime. And I have not done a study of how those properly disentangle. So I don't have a recipe for how to fix it, okay? But I will say it's very clear that right now, the expectations, and again, I mean, this is 2 years. Like, wow, predicting the future is hard. But the future looks not so great. I can tell you when I worked under the Murkowski administration, we were looking at this kind of trajectory of state budgets, and we were very concerned about it. I mean, very concerned about it. This is not a happy picture, right? So and most recently the legislative fiscal analyst wrote, the implications of the figures are severe. Simply constraining expenditure growth isn't going to get you there. We will have a very hard landing unless we do something about costs. We can't, right? And the imposition of broad-based taxes or the reduction or elimination of the permanent fund dividend and large reductions in capital budgets may not be sufficient to eliminate deficits. So the state certainly would be happier if it could enhance its revenue picture. And the best thing out there on the horizon is, ta-da, a Gasline. So the blue represents basically a projection not dissimilar to what we were looking at before of what the state's revenue picture looks like, its revenue picture going forward. The green represents what its revenue picture might look like if we had a gas line. And the state was indeed participating per the terms that were contemplated in the legislation that passed this last session. So it's a big deal, right? I mean, if this could happen, it's a big deal. So I need to talk about household energy needs and whether this project will provide cheap gas. So the state budget needs the project. So households, we're in Fairbanks. Enough said. You know about this. So the idea is we get a gas line and it'll be great because Fairbanks is going to have all this cheap gas and it'll be like Anchorage, which is cheap gas, and it'll be awesome and it'll be cheap and we'll be able to afford to live here and it'll be wonderful. We'll have what they have, only better, right? From an energy cost perspective on a household level. So my belief is that it is very unlikely that a gas line is going to provide cheap gas for Alaskans. And I'm going to try to explain why by addressing 4 different theories and then one hope for why a gas line might provide cheaper gas for interior and for Alaskans generally. So the first has to do with price as cost. We tend to assume that the cost of gas for Fairbanks should be basically, it should be the price of getting it here, right? The cost should be, the price should be the cost of getting it here plus, I don't know, $1. What do you want, right? It's just sitting there for crying out loud. That's not how this works. If we have a large project which connects the North Slope to international markets, the gas will then be worth what international markets say it's worth. It has nothing to do with the cost of getting it here. A big project might enjoy economies of scale and the transportation costs for getting it here might be relatively modest. But again, those costs are irrelevant to what prices for the gas would be here. because prices are determined by market transactions. And if I'm selling you gas, why would I sell to you when I can sell it to Bob over in Asia and he's willing to pay me a lot of money for it? So Exhibit A is what's happened in New South Wales. This is their experience with an LNG project. They used to have a whole lot of stranded gas, in effect. Local market, lots of gas, cheap gas, kind of good. LNG project happens. Now, all of a sudden, you can export that gas. What's the gas worth? What you can export it for. So this is just a recent headline about rapidly rising natural gas costs there as a function of connecting the local market to the international market. It's not rocket science. Same thing closer to home has happened in Cook Inlet. So NSTAR Natural Gas set up in prior winters when they had unmet needs for they didn't have all of their needs under contract. So they set up a little spot market during the wintertime, and they would go out a day ahead or 2 days ahead and say, we need gas. We've got this many thousands of cubic feet of gas that we don't have met, and so who wants to supply it to us? And they would take bids. And the bids would come in, and then they would take the lowest bids first until they had used up all of the gas that they needed to satisfy the market. And so when that market was operating, I believe it's no longer functional because Hilcorp has tied up the market now. But they've satisfied NSTAR's needs. But the minnows, Anchor Point Energy, Aurora Energy, small little niche players in Cook Inlet, they bid their gas into this market, and this is the monthly average price that they secured and achieved when they were playing in this market. If you look at what happened with ConocoPhillips, this is what they bid. Prices that are considerably higher. The ConocoPhillips prices, of course, are informed by the fact that ConocoPhillips owns an interest and now owns outright the LNG export plant. So they can choose whether to supply NSTAR or they could instead sell the gas overseas to Japan. And the black represents what they receive for their gas sales in Japan. And so you see that in Cook Inlet, in general, they were selling the gas for no less than what they could achieve overseas. This is just normal commercial behavior. This is not this is not unexpected. This is normal. And in fact, I would say ConocoPhillips would be derelict in their duty to their shareholders if they didn't engage in this behavior. It's their job. So, so there's another argument about why North Slope gas will be cheap, and that's because this is kind of a sophisticated argument. The argument is, look, LNG, if you know something about LNG markets, LNG projects are supported by long-term contracts that involve take or pay for the gas so that the people putting the projects together can be assured of being paid. The pricing terms in those contracts are always tied to transparent international indices, right? So the classic price for LNG in Asia, the sort of classic contract over the last number of years, is 14 to 15% of the dollar barrel of oil plus $1, more or less. That's the formula. They're oil-linked contracts. Recently, given that natural gas in North America is so much less expensive than oil on an energy equivalent basis, it's wildly less expensive. It's diverged radically from its historical relationship. They used to be on the order of about 8 to 1. It's now like 30 to 1, or 25 to 1. It's really come apart. There's been, of course, the buyers in Asia want North American prices. Link those prices to Henry Hub prices in Louisiana, North American natural gas prices, and we'll pay the cost of getting it here, and that looks much more favorable, right? So there's an argument that, well, the world's awash in natural gas. Eventually, the Asian markets, the prices are going to soften, and as the Asian markets prices soften, why that'll be good, because then prices for Fairbanks or Alaska will be cheaper, right? The problem is if prices soften and are linked to Henry Hub, this project won't happen. This is a graph from work that Black and Veatch did for the state in the royalty study for DNR last year. And what it shows is on the horizontal axis, it shows prices per MMBTU for natural gas. And on the vertical axis, it shows delivered prices per prices for natural gas for Henry Hub, that is U.S. Gulf natural gas prices. On the vertical axis, we have delivered prices into, say, Korea or Japan, right? These are approximate. And so the box kind of indicates, well, this is where you'd end up, roughly speaking, if you were linking Alaskan gas to Henry Hub prices, and we see prices between $8 and $12 delivered into Asia. But if that is the price delivered into Asia, it won't cover the overall costs of this project. There's way too much price risk to proceed with this enormously capital-intensive project. It just fails to cover the infrastructure costs and provide reasonable rates of return. So I think if this project's going to proceed, it's going to proceed on the basis of having previously negotiated long-term, that is at least 20-year probably, contracts that are linked to oil prices under traditional terms. So prices are not going to be soft. Or it just won't go forward. So price subsidies, well, where would they come from? Well, they could come from the producers. You know, as a part of a deal with the state, we might be able to negotiate that the producers provide a good price to the state, to state residential and commercial customers. It's possible. It could happen. I think it's unlikely. I would like to see it happen. I just think it's unlikely. Much of the stuff that the state can give, the state has already given in the bill that was passed. The state is agreeing to participate as an owner, and the state's agreeing to take its gas in kind, which is a huge darn deal, which I'm going to return to. There's not much else the state can give. It's possible. There's some other goodies, but not much. How about state subsidies? Why doesn't the state just subsidize with royalty gas? There are constitutional issues around that. The state, as a participant in this project, is sort of obligated under the Constitution, or at least under standard readings, to maximize the value of the hydrocarbons for the benefit of all of the people of the state. So there are also, I mean, if you think about it, they're pretty clearly you're going to run into some political issues about, well, why should some people in the state who happen to enjoy proximity to the pipeline enjoy cheap energy, whereas other people who are further away don't necessarily get that subsidized cheap energy. I'll speak as an academic for just a second. It's, I think, a terrible idea to subsidize prices like this. Like a terrible idea.
They've been doing it in Anchorage for 60 years. It appears to have worked.
I'm happy to dispute that, but not right now. I actually don't believe that's true.
Well, there's a big if for Anchorage. If we've got a pipeline going to South Central and an export terminal in South Central, will Cook Inlet gas be rated at an international rate? Right?
That's a great question. I'm going to come back to that. That's a great question. But I would submit that actually prices in Anchorage have not been subsidized. We've had segmented market, and we've had segmented market because the amount of production that was historically available vastly exceeded the size of the market. I think those were market transactions. But in any case. Now, I'm not saying people shouldn't get help with energy costs, but there's a better way of doing it. It makes much more sense to provide lump sum transfers of wealth from the state to its citizens and then you can decide what you want to do with it, rather than distorting the price signals, which provide very important information that should inform consumer behavior. So, I mean, why change Richard's cost of energy from $15 per MMBTU to $8 per MMBTU? Rather, my proposal is leave it at 15, but every year we'll write Richard a check more or less for the price difference. It's just a lump sum. Everybody gets the same amount. And then with that $1,000 or whatever it is, or $3,000 or whatever it is, he can choose to do what he wants to do. He could choose to weatherize his house. He could choose to move someplace else that had lower energy costs, you know, whatever it is. But onward. So, cook inlet-based pricing. What happens? Cook inlet-based pricing. There is a little noticed and brilliant part of the state's deal with TransCanada. It really has not received much attention, and it cheered me greatly to see it. I was surprised to see it. You know, I'm outside of the deal now. And that is free backhaul. The state's deal with TransCanada on the pipeline is the state gets free backhaul. And what does that mean? Well, backhaul is delivery by displacement. What does that mean? Well, that means, let's say there's an Aurora Energy in Cook Inlet, or Fury Energy, or Buccaneer, or one of these newer players, and they make a discovery of significant quantities of gas. They can put that gas into the project. Now, those molecules obviously aren't going to flow up to Fairbanks, right? But they will displace molecules that would, from the North Slope, that would otherwise make it into the tankers bound for Asia, okay? And that's called backhaul. It's delivery by displacement. And the state with TransCanada negotiated free backhaul. Why? Because it doesn't cost TransCanada anything to supply this service, right? So what that holds out is the possibility, anyway, is you certainly can imagine a market structure going forward where some lessees in Cook Inlet have gas resources. They don't have the ability to actually export the gas. They can't enjoy Asia prices. The North Slope producers can, because they own and control the highway. But the local Cook Inlet producers do not, just like we saw in the earlier slide with NSTAR, okay? And so in that circumstance, that Cook Inlet producer could make sales to Fairbanks at free transport. So your deal would then just involve negotiating a deal with a Cook Inlet producer. Now, for that to work, of course, Cook Inlet's got to stay vital, and people need to continue to discover gas. But, you know, Fairbanks' needs are really actually very small in the scheme of things. It's entirely possible that this might happen. I think this is by far the best opportunity for cheap gas from this project for Alaskans, and let's hope for a very vital Cook Inlet, both for Anchorage and for Fairbanks. But Anchorage isn't going to get cheap gas from a North Slope project, as I see it. I just don't see it, right? They may get cheap gas because Cook Inlet stays vital, but that's that. I need to speed up. So, so what are rewards? So the state, I mentioned before, the state's agreed to invest billions and billions of dollars into this project, straight up, even up, along with its gas take share. And they've also agreed to take all of its royalty gas on the project in kind, which means spending money to market the gas, taking counterparty risk. Well, I'll get into that in a minute, but there are a host of complications around becoming a commercial actor in this space, managing capacity and so on and so forth. So it's a really big, and we're taking the state's production tax in kind. This is a big deal. This is a really big deal. This is not normal. In fact, there is an argument to be made, not a bad argument. There's an argument to be made that there's actually almost zero state take associated with this project in terms of take as a sovereign taking without actually having to pay our way. Why? Because going forward, we're paying our way. All right? All of the risks that the producers are taking, or at least the vast majority of them, we're also taking. So the traditional way of thinking about state take is very different. We're taking on a lot of risk, and we're not backing in after the project is a success, right? We're wearing that risk up front, and the upfront money is the riskiest money. So why? Well, we might get a project out of it. That's kind of a big deal. We need a project. State budget needs a project in the worst way. Schools need a project, right? We need a project. Participating in this matter was probably critical to securing project expansion terms. The HOA, the heads of agreement between the state and the TransCanada and the producers, gives the state rights to expand the project all by itself if no other parties also want to join. That might be of considerable value in terms of opening up opportunities for other production on the North Slope. That's not a minor deal. And the effective transportation rate may end up being somewhat lower because the state is carrying its own gas. Assuming you need to be compensated for the risk that you're taking on, the biggest deal is that the state doesn't have to pay federal income tax. That's the state's big comparative advantage in this. So we gain something associated with that. Risks of state participation? Well, I think the biggest risk is this. We're a sovereign. We are not built to take ordinary business risks. It's not our competitive advantage. It's not particularly what we do well, right? Education, we do that pretty well, right? That's what we do, right? Fire, police, we do that stuff pretty well. That's what we do. Trying to be accountable to the citizens, we do that pretty well. That's what we do. Taking on commercial business risk of an incredibly sophisticated enterprise, that's not our normal thing. So that's inherently much riskier for us to do than for ExxonMobil to do. The state is well aware of this, and they are working very hard, I believe, I have to believe, they are working very hard to manage this. But it's real. I mean, it's inescapable, so it's real. At the same time, right, one of the reasons why the state isn't built for doing this is we can't go out of business. We can't go bankrupt, right? We are the state of Alaska. We can't go bankrupt. We can't just walk away. We have obligations to each other through the state's governing functions. I mean, at the end of the day, BP, if it has another horrible experience like Macondo, at the end of the day, it can go bankrupt, right? People will lose money. Shareholders will lose money. That'll be really unfortunate for those shareholders. But at the end of the day, it's just money, right? We've got to educate our children and protect each other and so on. So these are risks. I'm not saying these are risks that we shouldn't take. I'm not opining on that. I mean, I have my own views, but that's neither here nor there. But these are risks, and they're extraordinary ones. So what are the risks that I worry about? I worry about black swan events. I worry about catastrophic failures of infrastructure. I worry about terrorist attacks. I worry about catastrophic failures in price. I worry about the things I cannot articulate, the Donald Rumsfeld unknown unknowns. That's the stuff I worry about. Because again, at the end of the day, we can't go bankrupt. And that concerns me greatly to take those risks. I can tell you, I'm quite confident that the people who are managing the ship and state government are aware of all of this, and they are very concerned about it. This is a big deal. There are also partner risks. I mean, the state is entering into this mega project lacking the sophistication of its partners. And when I worked for the state, this is something that it was my job to worry about all the time. And this is what will keep you up at night. It did keep me up at night hundreds of nights. Worrying about all of the ways in which you might get taken to the cleaners that you haven't thought of yet. It's scary, right? So this is a long list of risks associated with taking gas in kind that was developed by Black and Veatch. It articulates a lot of the things that I've already articulated. You know, it's real. So the state is stepping out in an enormous way in terms of doing this deal. So why? Well, our options to force a project are extremely limited. We have pretty dire needs for a project. And so it is a reasonable thing to do to take what measures that are otherwise uncomfortable. I mean, this is not what we normally do. It is uncomfortable. There are benefits, clearly, perhaps, from doing them. And I think that's why things are proceeding this way. A project, should it proceed, and I'm incredibly excited at the idea that it really might, I think we truly are further along than we have ever been. I really profoundly believe that. The project will confer many benefits. I don't think cheap gas is likely to be one of those, except for you guys, you get backhaul, and that might work out. So let's hope for a healthy Cook Inlet. And with that, I'll stop and be happy to take questions and tomatoes at this point.
Yeah, first, I think you've done a marvelous job of saying both sides of the equation, the risks and the opportunities here. But, you know, with this last summary, the word that comes to my mind is the state really feels desperate to me. It feels desperate for just one more pipeline and we won't piss it away this time. You know, that's exactly the sense I'm getting about all this. And we're putting so much on the line. We're doing things no other sovereign's done, which is take a big share of the risk. And what are the advantages of taking all of our tax shares, normal tax shares in kind? What's the advantage of that?
So for the state, what's the advantage of that? Yeah. I think we might get a project out of the deal. Well, I can't opine about that. I can't know. Nobody at the end of the day can know that question, right? We can't know because the other side will tell you what they tell you. They say, this is what we need. The concept of state tax gas in kind, I first heard about in a presentation from a gentleman from BP in 2003. That was the first time this subject was raised. This has been a concept which has been on their minds now for over a decade. Well, if the state is taking its tax in kind and is carrying its tax gas in kind, right, on the infrastructure that it is paying for, in essence, the producer, the lessee, isn't carrying the state's weight. The state's carrying its own weight, right? If I'm taking 15%, it's not that much. If I'm taking more or less 12.5% of gross production as tax gas, but to get that gas to market, I also have to pony up proportionate 12.5% of overall project costs. The state is now basically a participant in the project. It is acting like a lessee. When I spoke before about why in some ways this shouldn't be viewed as state take, that was why. Okay, it's because the state is paying for the pipeline that carries its own freight. at the end of the day, whether that is a bad or good deal depends upon whether you think there are alternatives in a meaningful time frame. And that's something about which reasonable people can disagree, right?
Well, how does that relate to binding future legislatures?
I've said nothing here about fiscal certainty, right? Right? The state taking gas in kind by itself says nothing about fiscal certainty, right? I mean, it's very clear. The state could turn around saying, okay, well, we're taking our production tax in kind, but guess what? There is a new tax. It's called the excise tax, right? And it's going to be X percent of the value of your production, right? So fiscal certainty is another deal. It's another shoe to drop. And we'll see how that works out. That's coming. It wasn't addressed in this last go round. I think quite appropriately. I think it's, for the state, the issue of fiscal certainty is once you give that there, it's done, right? You can't change anything anymore come hell or high water. And so it makes sense to me anyway that it's sort of the last rock in the jar, right? That's the last thing that you would give up. So again, looking at how this thing has been structured and how it's proceeding, there's a certain amount of logic to how this is unfolding, at least to my eyes. Yeah. Yes?
In the pre-feed and feed stages, the early parts of your presentation, is there any penalty for the state of Alaska to say no game?
That's a really good question. The question was, what happens if the state were to say, you know what, this is a really dumb idea, we bail, right? So the legislature convenes next session, next January, and the very first thing they do is they say, you know what, we hated that bill, and we're cutting funding, we're taking it all back. Well, they can't take back what they've already given to AGDC which is the state corporation, which will own the midstream piece of this thing, which has been appropriated a bunch of money to do the first year or so of pre-feed, the state's share of pre-feed expenditures. So I don't think the state could actually get that back unless they got rid of AGDC. I mean, it would be heroic. So I think the short answer is, practically speaking, no. It's not, the state's share is not a huge amount, right? The state's notionally 25% of that $450 million. It's not chump change.
Well, the reason I asked that, during the last legislative session, there was a lot of talk about, basically we're giving TransCanada a chunk of this, so we don't have to pay them for something that they didn't do anyway. And I was wondering how that all fit into this scenario.
Yeah. The pre-feed is sort of going forward. The state's requirement for ponying up pre-feed, the state doesn't have to pony up TransCanada's share of pre-feed expenditures. TransCanada has to do that. There are a bunch of details about what happens if the state were to buy out TransCanada's interest. Then certain things happen in terms of paying TransCanada basically a certain breakup fee for the money that they've spent to date. As well, if at the end of pre-feed the project doesn't move forward, there's a certain amount of again, breakup in terms of what TransCanada receives in terms of breakup fee to compensate for them for their expenditures to date. I'm not sure if I've answered your question. I hope so.
There was a session this morning about SB 138 from Senator Pete Kelly, and he talks about exactly that question, and he says you can go right up to the decision point, which is about 2020, and the state could still say no.
but you'd have sunk costs of about $5 billion at that point that you wouldn't get back. Say no.
Yes, that's my understanding as well. And Senator Kelly is in a much better position, having sat through hours of testimony on this, actually, than I am. I mean, I'm familiar with this project historically in terms of the market dynamics and commercial considerations and so on. But quite honestly, I'm not a true expert on all of the details of this particular deal. But that's my understanding as well from having read the heads of agreement in the MOU and listened to some of the testimony in front of the legislature, is that indeed the state does have the option to sort of walk away, but there will be costs. And if the state walks away at final investment decision time and the other parties want to proceed, the cost might involve no project, which would be a big deal, right? But we'll just have to see. Chancellor Rogers.
The government of Norway has participated with the oil and gas industry in a variety of developments. Do you know enough about how they structured those to be able to compare and contrast with what the state's doing in this deal?
It's a really good question, and the short answer is really no. I have an understanding of how Norway does it, but it's pretty thin. Norway does have a state oil company, but they've participated in the land position from the very beginning. But the exact relationship between the state oil company and the Norwegian government and how those funds flow and who takes what risks and how they're insulated and so on, those details actually profoundly matter in terms of the risk that Norway has taken on as a sovereign in terms of participating. And I really don't know those details. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Can you speculate what impact the outcome of ballot measure 1 will have on the gas line?
I could, but I won't.
Why not?
At the end of the day, I'm not sure that it's helpful. I mean,
You're not sure what's helpful.
speculating about the outcome of what Measure 1 does for a gas line. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of imponderables, and I don't know what to think about that one. I certainly know what I would do if I were a lessee. I know what I would say if I were a lessee, but, you know. And it might be right. You know, I don't know. I don't know what'll happen. Be interesting.
If this becomes essentially, it sort of sounds like the state would be kind of an investor here. So like if I was an investor, I would have to have a worthwhile portfolio to move forward on a project. Does that mean that we need to be thinking now about our mega projects that could potentially affect our portfolio for 2020? So suddenly 2020 comes around and it's like, yeah, we built this dam, we built this other pipeline, we kind of overspent, and so we were desperate, and we were hoping this would work, but now we have nothing. Is that?
That's a really great question, right? I mean, so it's a really great question. So the state has a certain amount of savings, right, that we've built up over the last 10 years-ish. And, you know, outside of the permanent fund, it's on the order of $15 billion or something, shrinking fast. And so there are only so many things we can do with it, right? We can live beyond our means for a few more years. We can make certain kinds of capital investments. Hopefully, we don't spend all of it on engineering studies, right? I mean, that would be unfortunate, which is not to discount engineering and studies and environmental work. Yeah. But No, I mean, it really isn't. The fact of the matter is you don't get to do real projects unless you do that stuff first. It is a necessary step, right? Absolutely. But you're right, we can't do everything. We're unlikely to be able to do everything. I think one of the things that I'm particularly interested in terms of my research at the university, that I think is most vital and important, is for the state to figure out how to better leverage its pennies in attracting private investment. The state ideally wants to form partnerships where we take some of the appropriate risks that we should take on, some of them, the ones that private investors otherwise can't take on, and then liberate private investment. I mean, one of the things that's going on in terms of, say, photovoltaic energy systems worldwide, it is astonishing what's happened with PV in terms of collapsing cost. It's truly staggering. Now, of course, PV, it only works when the sun shines, right? But because diesel is so expensive in Alaska, there are many places in Alaska given federal tax credits, which pay for a third of private investment and none of state investment. And given a very accelerated tax depreciation associated with photovoltaic installations, there are places in Alaska where I believe it would make a lot of sense for private investors to spend money here. However, there are material transaction costs for doing business here, right? Like little projects. It's like hard to get anybody's attention around a little teeny installation, right? So that kind of upfront resource assessment, site development work, putting together lots of little deals to create one bigger deal that has enough scale for an investor to actually be interested in, that's stuff we could do. It's the kind of thing that we need to really start looking at hard, is figure out how, because the world is awash in private capital. It's looking for a home. And so might as well be us. Yeah.
When you were listing risks, I don't think you mentioned environmental lawsuits. And it occurs to me a project like this could be delayed for many years if the right kind of lawsuits are filed. That would have an expense and a cost.
It would. It would. And not to discount it. I mean, those are potentially material. They're not catastrophic, right? The risks that, I mean, so you have environmental litigation and the project gets delayed for 3 years. The really big risk is that the market turns upside down on you in that period of time. You know, costs explode or whatever, right? I mean, lawsuits are a problem when that happens. Lawsuits that delay being able to start earning a return on the hundreds of millions of dollars that you've spent so far, or maybe, you know, the state's share would be in hundreds of millions, we can weather that, right? Having to make debt service payments when the project has blown up, right? A train in the LNG facility blows up for whatever reason. A meteor, an airplane, a terrorist attack. I don't know, right? But that does keep me up at night. I mean, those are the things that I worry about because you can't quantify those risks. And yet you know every once in a while they happen. So.
You haven't mentioned the ASAP line at all. I mean, is that, I was wondering why.
Because I'm talking about the big pipeline. Next. No, really, I don't want to, it is. But there are lots of projects that are out there. But actually, seriously, I've done analyses of that project, and I have my studied views, and I would like to keep them to myself right now. And
Doesn't mean you couldn't say something.
It's true. I have, but I'm going to keep them to myself right now. That's a project I don't believe in its existing configuration will ever get built. I just don't think it will. I don't think it makes any sense. But other people disagree with me. And, you know, I consider Dan Fauske a really good friend of mine. He's a great guy, and he's convinced the project makes sense, and he's a really smart guy. He's made a hell of a lot more money than I ever will. So, you know, what do I know?
Can you talk a little bit more about the idea of the backhaul gas you were mentioning?
Sure.
It seems to me that, and maybe I misunderstood, but if Cook Inlet producers are able to export gas into a big pipe and export to Asia, then any backhaul gas, consumers in Anchorage will get the same benefit as potential consumers in Fairbanks. But am I misunderstanding that?
Well, consumers in Anchorage, okay, if there's enough native production in Cook Inlet by producers who don't have access to export, they can't liquefy their gas, right? And they can't put it on ships, then Anchorage consumers will benefit. But the point is that Fairbanks consumers may also benefit because of this backhaul provision that was negotiated. And they do it pretty much in the same way. It's like, you know, Buccaneer, after they're done selling all the gas they can shove down NSTAR's throat, they're still looking for a home to sell gas, so they come to you, and they can sell you gas now. Backhaul. It's pretty cool.
Are there any examples from other countries out there where they've tried to solve this issue, or?
Well, backhaul is ubiquitous in the lower 48. It happens all the time. Backhaul usually has a charge, okay? Pipelines can flow gas bidirectionally, right? The gas isn't actually generally flowing bidirectionally, but there is backhaul. The thing is the pipeline companies typically earn a profit on that, right? It's a source of profits. And generally speaking, the conventional arrangement is more or less a 50-50 split of the benefits of backhaul between the existing anchor shippers who have firm transportation commitments and the pipeline, right? So I sign up as a shipper for a long-term deal. Pipeline goes and sells a bunch of backhaul. Well, they can't sell backhaul unless I've signed up for my firm deal, right? So they have to give me some of the benefits of that. That's how commercially those arrangements usually work in the lower 48. In this case, the state negotiated a deal where it gets backhaul essentially for free, which is awesome.
So MLNP bought gas many years ago and owned its own gas, and that's one of the reasons Anchorage has had such low pricing. Would that then, given the backhaul, if a line comes, does that argue that maybe Golden Valley or Fairbanks should look at acquiring gas in Cook Inlet to make sure we have a supply?
It's an option worth considering. Yeah, I mean, given backhaul, you could move gas from Cook Inlet. So, yeah, I mean, yeah. Depends on prices and risks and everything else, but yeah.
Yeah, well, the Premier of British Columbia recently said that because they're going to develop gas exports in BC, they're going to start a permanent fund on their anticipated revenues. Now, what's the state of the BC export terminals?
Quite honestly, I can't keep up. There are news stories about this stuff all the time, and I no longer have my finger on the pulse of what's going on in terms of latest commercial developments. I'm sorry.
I think we just have time for one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
Is there much discussion about the points of distribution along the line, like at the Yukon River and various other places that are logical? Are those known now? Or?
I feel terrible because I can't answer that question. I think so, but I'm not sure. I think that's actually something that'll actually probably get quite firmed up over the next 18 months. But I'm sorry, I'm just not on top of that as I wish I were. I apologize. So, thank you guys very much.